Hello YouTube, thank you for clicking on this video and shout out to Big Daddy Algorithm for pimping it out to you. My name is Megan and welcome to my channel. I am a self-taught historical sewist and I recreate garments that I see in fashion plates and museums and portraits entirely by hand using only the methods and materials that would have been available at the time of the original garment's creation, which basically just means that I see something, I like something, I make something, that's how I roll. So, as you'll notice, the space buns are back by popular demand, and by popular demand, I really just mean my boyfriend, who said to me once that he thought they were cute. So that's the only comment I've ever gotten on my hair from anybody, so I'm gonna roll with that now. If y'all want me to do something different with my hair, drop me a comment below and we'll see what kind of wacky hairstyles we can come up with together. So, today I'm going to be talking about Regency fashion. Yes, this is the much long-awaited video on Regency fashion and what that was all about. And by long-awaited, I mean that I was the one who has been long-awaiting this because it means that I have finally finished my circa 1806 Regency gown and I'm so excited. I'm going to show you guys at the end of this video, so stick around till the end and you'll get to see some pretty dress porn. Oh yeah! But before we get into that, I want to talk to you a little bit about Regency fashion, what it's about, how it came to be, why we love it so much, and why I decided to create a Regency gown, even though this is not my favorite era in history. I will not be looking at the camera too much today because I have my laptop here with my notes. I did have to do a lot of research for this video, so I did not trust my poor executive function challenged brain to actually retain all the information that I was gathering. So I wrote it all down, scripted it out. So I'm going to be looking at my laptop for prompts. So I got a couple comments in my last video that I wasn't making a lot of eye contact with the camera. So sorry about that. I still will not be making a lot of eye contact with the camera just because I do have to look at my notes because I don't want to give you guys wrong information because then I'll get canceled. So anyways, enough babbling, let's talk about Regency fashion. So fashion changed really drastically in the year 1795. In my last video, I talked about fashion in the late 1700s and how it was very opulent with lots of trimmings and flounces and a really big emphasis on the width of the skirts and also with lots of understructures like stays and panniers and hoops, etc. So I highly recommend that you go check out that video before you get too much into this if you haven't seen it already, because that's just going to give you a really good basic understanding of the fashion that came before the Regency period and how it affected the Regency period. So go check that out. I will link you down below. Probably have a card somewhere on the screen as well up here, so definitely go check that out. So in 1795, fashion changed really drastically. Skirts had been getting narrower and waistlands, no. Skirts had been getting narrower and waistlines getting higher throughout the late 1780s and into the early 1790s. And then in 1795, bam, the silhouettes took a really drastic turn. So this is when we see the introduction of the empire waist with this tall columnar skirt that fell from under the bust line and straight to the floor. This is kind of the iconic silhouette of the Regency period. If any of you have ever seen any kind of Jane Austen adaptation whatsoever, then you will know that this is kind of what the Regency period was known for. You immediately see the silhouette, but it started really in 1795. At this point, the skirts still retained their fullness from previous decades, but they just lost the understructures and the sleeves of the gowns became shorter. So we still see these really full skirts gathered into a waistband. They just lost all the hoops and the bustles that had been worn in previous decades before that, and they became a little bit deflated. And that's how we get that narrower silhouette, which became more and more narrow as the decades rolled on through this period. By this time, cotton had become dominant, and while silk was still used for formal wear, day dresses and even many ball and dinner gowns were made of cotton. I talked about cotton versus silk again in my last video about the chemise à la reine, so definitely go check that out. Once again, I really do recommend that you go check out that video because everything I'm saying in this one will make a lot more sense if you have that basic knowledge. So anyways, yes, but the takeaway is that cotton had become more important than silk by this point, by 1795. So most people's dresses were made of cotton rather than the silk that we had been used to in previous decades. In the mid to late 1790s, trimming began to be used sparingly, if at all, and gowns became simpler, more pared down, and understated. So this very simple aesthetic became dominant. All of the trimmings and the bows and the lace and the frills of previous decades fell out of fashion rather quickly, like literally fell off a cliff out of fashion. This was a radical departure from the structured and maximalist fashions of the past few centuries, and it reflected the socio-political culture of the time. Like Diana Vreeland said once,
"The fashion world changes all the time. You can even see the approaching revolution in clothes. You can see and feel everything in clothes."
If you want to know what's going on politically, socially, economically in a certain place at a certain time, look at what people are wearing. It will tell you a lot about what was going on at that time. So what happened in 1795? Well, France was in the middle of its revolution, with the First Republic being declared 3 years prior in 1792. The country was also at war with Austria, Italy, and Prussia, who were all long-established monarchies and fighting to keep revolutionary sentiments out of their countries. So they didn't want that nasty democratic stuff to bleed over into their borders. The rulers of Austria, Italy, and Prussia were also related to the French king and queen, Louis XVI and Marie-Antoinette, who had been executed in 1793. So there's also that. That was a reason that they declared war on the French Republic as well. Also, the Reign of Terror had ended a year before in 1794, and during that time, over 16,000 people had been guillotined on charges of counter-revolutionary activity, with another 40,000 being executed by other means or who had died awaiting trial.
Les gens sont en prison parce qu'ils ont dit bonjour une fois à un prêtre réfractaire, ou parce qu'ils disent du bien de Mirabeau, ou parce qu'ils ont de la famille à l'étranger.
So a lot of people in France had been killed for basically no reason. If you know anything about the Reign of Terror, it was a really darkly fascinating time in history. When the terror was in full swing, people were arrested for just the slightest hint of any counter-revolutionary sentiment, like complaining about the price of bread or wearing the wrong color of ribbon on their hats. There was a story once about a woman who was in a bar and she had gotten a little drunk, and she complained that the new revolutionary coins were like worth nothing, and someone overheard her and reported her to the authorities, and the next day she was arrested and thrown into one of the most notorious prisons in Paris. I can't remember if she was actually guillotined or not, but she was very certainly imprisoned for a long time because of those sentiments. So it was a very dangerous time where neighbors were spying on neighbors. You could be reported to the authorities for the least little thing. It was a lot more autocratic than the monarchy had ever been. This dark period during the revolution ended with the execution of Robespierre in 1794. And Robespierre had been the de facto leader of France during the First Republic, and he was also the architect of the Terror. He rose to power during the revolution between like 1792 and 1794. He was very autocratic. He went from being a very democratic person who was actually against the death penalty to becoming increasingly paranoid and suspicious as he gained more and more power and summarily executed like literally tens of thousands of people. So it was a really dark period in France's history. Their modern republic was born out of a lot of bloodshed. But after Robespierre's death, cooler heads prevailed, and a treaty in December of 1794 allowed for freedom of worship again and helped pave the way towards peace with the other European powers. France was obviously a very Catholic country, and the monarchy had close ties to the Catholic Church, and then during the revolution they broke ties with Catholicism, and if you were seen worshiping in the old ways, that was considered counter-revolutionary and you could be imprisoned for that. And in fact, many tens of thousands of priests were also executed, and nuns and monks and people who belonged to religious orders. This treaty at the end of 1794 was a really big deal because it restored the freedom of worship to the people of France. So things were starting to calm down. The revolution was becoming more moderate, less extreme. However, despite the fact that revolutionary sentiment was starting to die down, it was still very much established, and the revolution and its ideals of democracy and liberty and equality had been firmly established. So by 1795, those revolutionary ideals were not going anywhere. But by 1795, a radical departure from the old regime of Marie-Antoinette and Louis XVI had taken place and taken hold, and this was reflected in the fashions, so there was no going back. Excessive trimmings and heavily architectural gowns were seen as aristocratic and outdated, with no place in the new democratic France. And in fact, just a few years prior, wearing these kinds of gowns would have gotten someone killed. And the simplicity of the new silhouette reflected the sobriety of the times, and it was a nod to the Republican virtues of liberty and equality. The new gowns were looser and much more comfortable to wear. Throughout the 1780s and 1790s, stays had gotten shorter and shorter to accommodate the gradual raising of the waistline, and by 1795, stays were essentially just a bra that was laced up at the back. So even as early as the mid-1780s, we're seeing stays starting to shorten a little bit. This continued on throughout the Revolutionary period and into the late 1790s, where the waistlines of gowns became higher and higher. Because the waistline was higher, that conical silhouette that had been in fashion throughout most of the 1700s fell out of fashion, and the waistline lost its definition, so stays didn't have to be as long as they had been before. And actually, many women chose to forego their stays altogether and wore gowns out of a thin, translucent cotton with only a petticoat underneath. Some women chose to forego petticoats as well. They were called les merveilleuses. I'm sorry if I butchered the pronunciation of that. There was a group of women who just discarded underthings altogether and just wore these very loose, transparent gowns, and that was for them a form of liberation. The new aesthetic was inspired by the fashions of ancient Greece, as classical philosophy and the political organization of the ancient Roman Republic were the intellectual foundations of the revolution. So a lot of the revolutionary rhetoric had taken its inspiration from ancient Rome and from ancient Greece. That was reflected in the fashions, with women wanting to look like Greek goddesses and Roman goddesses, and dressing like this was a way to show support and solidarity for the revolution and its ideals. By the time Napoleon Bonaparte came to power in 1799, this new silhouette was already well established and was showing signs of going nowhere anytime soon. Empress Josephine was particularly enamored of this style, as she sought to visually differentiate herself from the aristocratic fashions of the 1770s and 1780s, i.e. anything and everything Marie-Antoinette would have worn and loved. So Empress Josephine, the wife of Napoleon, really wanted to differentiate herself from everything that had come before. She wanted to really establish this new direction in France and to show her support and solidarity for those revolutionary ideals. Even though she basically moved into the Palace of Versailles and they reestablished all the old protocols that had governed the lives of royals for hundreds of years.
Each arrival. And you must not reach for anything, for the handing of an item to the Dauphine is a guarded privilege. It must go to the highest rank in the room.
People were made duchesses and dukes, and the aristocracy basically came back again. She still wanted to sartorially separate herself from that old regime, as if to say, yes, I'm here, however, we are different from the old aristocracy, and this is why, because look at what we're wearing. And by 1799, this particular style had been exported to the rest of Europe, and it was adopted by all classes of society, which is why we see it over and over again in our favorite Jane Austen adaptations. And I think we have a tendency to associate it with England and British fashions, which is where it definitely blossomed and took off. But this type of style has its origins in France and in the Revolution, and would not have happened at all if not for the Revolution. Though we know it as Regency fashion, this particular style actually has several names depending on where you are and what country you're referring to. In France, this was known as the Napoleonic era or the First Empire. In America, it was the Federalist era, and in England, it was the Regency period. So this encompasses the time period from about 1792 all the way up until the 1820s. So it's quite a long period of time. Those dates varied from country to country, but when we talk about this style, this is really the time period that we're talking about. So the very end of the 18th century and the first couple decades of the 19th century. By 1810, skirts narrowed out even more and the waistline became even higher. A new type of stays were introduced to accommodate the more body-hugging styles, and they were much more flexible as they were made from heavy cotton and corded to stiffen them rather than boned with baleen or reeds. The short stays were still in use, but the longer stays became really popular as the gowns got more and more fitted throughout the middle of the 1810s. I've actually heard modern reenactors say that if you're a little bit fuller of figure, those are actually more comfortable to wear because they smooth everything out, sort of like the Titanic era fashion. And I've heard women who are a little bit like on the thinner side or have smaller breasts, such as myself, say that short stays are more comfortable because if you don't really have any boobs, they kind of just lift them up into the right positions. So I made short stays a little while ago in preparation for my Regency build, and I don't have anything else to compare it to because I haven't made the long line stays yet. But I can definitely say that the short stays, if you are smaller chested, are really comfortable and they do actually lift everything into position, and I don't really have much to heave up into position.
He wants a ticket to the itty bitty titty committee.
But the stays definitely did that for me and made it look like I actually do have something there. So they did work for me. If there are any women out there who have bigger breasts and have tried the long line stays from like the 1810s, please weigh in on the comments. I would love to hear your experience with them. I would love to hear how they fit for you, especially if you've tried those and the short stays. Like, please weigh in. I really want to hear from you guys. I only have my experience to go off of, so I would love to hear what other people's experiences have been. But anyways, I digress. Back to fashion. In the 1810s, when Jane Austen was in full swing, long sleeves were worn during the day, with short puffy sleeves being popular for evening and formal wear. Stovepipe bonnets were also worn during the day, and as the decade wore on, these got longer and longer, leading to some really interesting sartorial cartoons. I'm actually going to do a whole video at some point about men making fun of women's fashion throughout history, because I have some opinions on that. I think maybe for my next video, I'm going to be doing a whole like deep dive into sartorial cartoons and like the way that men have degraded and made fun of women's fashion throughout history, and how that has led to some of the tragic things that we wear today in this day and age. But yes, I will save that for another video. Like, if you're interested in fashion and feminism and how those two things go together, definitely check out some sartorial cartoons throughout history. I think you'll find a lot in there to unpack. Okay, I'm digressing a lot. Back to fashion. Spencers were short jackets that were worn during the day, and these could be very elaborately trimmed. In the middle of the 1810s, the defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo started a trend for military styles in England, and we see a lot of Spencer jackets from this period being trimmed with brass buttons and braids and epaulets to mimic a soldier's uniform. By the early 1820s, after steadily climbing for almost 35 years, the waistline had finally reached its highest point, and dresses had become essentially just bras with skirts attached. After this, the waistline gradually came down again, and skirts started becoming fuller and more elaborately trimmed until we get to the wild, wacky, and opulent and romantic fashions of the 1830s. But that's another video for pretty much never, because I honestly hate this period and everything about it, so I will never be doing a video about the 1830s unless it's a video to say how much I detest the 1830s. So if you happen to like this decade and these fashions, then power to you. Again, please comment and tell me what you love about it, because I find it really hard. I can't do it, guys. I can't do the 1830s. Anyway, I digress. So this brings me to my next point. Why are we as modern people so obsessed with Regency fashion? Well, I have a few theories. One of them is that fashions from other eras, like the mid to late Victorian period or the entirety of the 18th century or the Elizabethan era, can feel foreign and alien and just plain weird. They challenge our modern beauty standards because in the past, women dressed to look wealthy rather than to look attractive or beautiful or sexy, which is mainly what we do today. We dress to look nice, we dress to look our best, we dress to be comfortable, but one thing we rarely do today is dress to display our wealth and status and power. Fashion in the past was a demonstration of wealth and status. It still is today, you know, hello designer logos. I will probably do a deep dive into that as well at some point. But in the past, status was communicated by things like how much physical space you took up, or how many things you could attach to your clothing, or how drastically you could afford to alter your physical shape, or the materials that your clothing was made of. Basically, the more elaborate and colorful you were, the wealthier and higher your status was in society. So it was more is more throughout history, which doesn't really resonate with us as modern people. We have a very minimalist aesthetic. Even maximalism in modern fashion is still minimal compared to what they did in the past. Like, you think color blocking today is extra? You should have seen what they did in like the early 1700s, guys. Like, I mean, colors that you would never have thought would have gone together. These people were walking around looking like flags of countries because that was the thing at the time. But to us, that feels really foreign and alien. Fashions of the past also look and feel too impractical for our modern sensibilities. When I make and wear historical clothing, I often get comments like,
I would never have the patience to put all of that on.
And I
hate tight clothing. I don't know how you stand it.
And
doesn't it take forever to get dressed?
And yes, it does. That's the whole point. We forget that women of the past had a different definition of comfort than we do. For them, being comfortable wasn't about stretchy fabrics and elastic waistbands. It was about the mental comfort of knowing that you always look presentable and put together and that you never have to feel frumpy, dumpy, messy, or unattractive. Abby Cox actually did a really fantastic video about this when she was talking about what it was like to wear 18th century clothing every day. So I'm gonna link to her video because she does a whole deep dive into mental comfort versus physical comfort and what was prioritized by people in the past. I'm gonna link to her video because it's fabulous. Also, for most of Western history, women didn't work. And I'm talking upper and middle class and aristocratic women here. I'm not talking working class women, although working class women did still wear corsetry and a lot more layers than we would today. But again, that's another video for another time. But I'm talking more about upper class women just because they were the ones who decided what fashion was. They were the ones who moved fashion forward. That's why I'm talking about. Not because working class women were uninteresting, just because they didn't move fashion along as much as upper class women did. Because they didn't work, women of the past didn't have to be practical. For a very long time, clothing was the means through which women expressed themselves artistically because very few other avenues of expression were open to them. So they went wild with their clothes, and the results are just stunning. As we see women gain more and more independence and freedom throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, men began to dictate fashion more and more, as we see through the works of Charles Worth and Charles James and Christian Dior, etc. That's also another interesting topic. I wasn't planning on doing a video about that, but if you guys want me to do a video on men dictating women's fashion, I can definitely do that. Let me know, drop me a comment. My point is, with all of this, that Regency fashion is having a moment right now because it's a historical fashion that we as modern people can relate to. The pared down practicality of Regency clothing compared to the complicated opulence of the periods directly before and after it feel familiar and accessible to us. A lot of Regency styles aren't that different from modern ones, and the general lack of corsetry and complicated understructures of the Regency period make it easy and safe for us to explore as modern people. Of course, the popularity of shows like Bridgerton and the revival of Jane Austen's work in recent decades has brought the Regency era into the cultural zeitgeist in a big way. As social media dominates our lives and we enter into this era of climate change and uncertainty and authoritarianism, there is a nostalgia out there for a simpler time where manners and etiquette were at the forefront of every social interaction, and everyone knew their place and what was expected of them, and life moved more slowly and gracefully. Do I personally love this era of fashion? No. I definitely feel that nostalgia sometimes, but it's not for this particular time in history. My nostalgia focuses more on like the 1780s and the old aristocratic regimes, especially in France. Regency period doesn't really mean much to me. I don't really have any emotional ties with it the way I do with like other time periods. I also don't have a practical bone in my body. I'm a sucker for opulence, and I've never been afraid of a little complexity, but I can definitely understand why people do love this era so much. I'm also not one to knock something before I try it though, so I've spent the past 4 months meticulously hand sewing and embroidering a circa 1806 gown just so I could see for myself what all the Regency hype was about. I made this gown out of a soft white cotton muslin that I ordered from India, much like they would have done in the 18th century, and I embroidered it with whitework. I actually did a whole video on whitework embroidery and showed a little bit of my process working on this gown, so I'm going to link to that in the description below as well. If you want to know more about whitework embroidery, it's a really interesting and beautiful technique, so I definitely would recommend checking that out. I drafted the pattern for the gown myself based on the research I'd done about gown construction in the early 1800s, and all in, the process took about 4 months. So it was a labor of love. It was a long project. I just finished it this past Saturday, and I think I started in like the end of May or something like that. So it's been a process, and I'm super proud of myself for finishing it. It's probably the longest I've ever worked on a project aside from my circa 1901 ball gown that I did for last Christmas. As with all my projects, historical accuracy was very important to me, so I only used techniques and materials that would have been available to a seamstress in 1806. I didn't film the making of this gown because I started it way before launching this channel, but I will be making filming a pink Spencer jacket next, so I'm going to be filming more of my process with that. Although, to be honest with you guys, I kind of hate filming my sewing process just because I have to angle my work in weird ways so that the camera picks it up, and then I have to make sure my lighting is okay, and I have to set up the camera a certain way, and it just really gets in the way of my actual sewing. So filming tutorials and like filming my sewing process actually sets me back a lot in my work, so it's really annoying and I kind of hate it. So to be honest, I probably will not be doing that as much. I might be filming like just little updates here and there, but in terms of like actually filming myself drafting and stitching and doing all of that, I may or may not do that. I haven't decided yet. Let me know in the comments how much you like really want to see that. If you couldn't care one way or the other, then also let me know that, because then I'm not going to do it. So again, like, let me know. Yes, I will be recreating the pink silk Spencer jacket, the one that's in the Chertsey Museum that everybody in the costume community just like drools over. I'm going to be doing a recreation of that next. So like I will definitely be like updating you guys so you can see. And speaking of seeing, without further ado, here is my finished Regency gown at last. Enjoy all the moody sunset clouds as I prance through a field in my floaty white ethereal gown. It was really fun to film this. It was kind of raining at the time, but anyways, I'm digressing once again. You guys, you gotta tell me to stop babbling, seriously. So that was my spiel about Regency fashion. Thanks for watching this video all the way through, to like the two of you who actually do that. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I am almost at 200 subscribers at the time of filming this video, and my last video got like over 1,000 views within like a week of being up. So that is amazing, because it was my 3rd video ever. So that is because you guys supported me, and I'm so grateful for that. So thank you for helping my tiny channel grow. I super appreciate it. And I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you guys in the next one. Toodaloo.